There are acts of care that look from the outside identical to acts of harm. The same hands, the same vessel, the same table set in the same way for different people on different evenings. What changes is the intention, and intention is invisible until the results arrive over years. In the mountain communities of Appalachia in the early 20th century, a woman who fed people was a woman of standing. Feeding was the primary act of domestic power available to women in those communities, the mechanism through which they managed health, hospitality, relationship, and, in the hands of women who understood plants and preparation, something considerably more than any of those. Dorinda Cole of Wise County, Virginia, was known across 3 communities as a woman of extraordinary generosity at the table. People came to her door and she fed them. She fed them well and often and with a consistency that people spoke about in terms of real gratitude. What those people did not know, what became clear only in the autumn of 1911, when a county physician began comparing notes with a physician in the adjacent county and found a pattern that neither of them could explain through any single natural cause, was that Dorinda Cole's table was not set for everyone equally. Some people she fed in one direction, some she fed in another. The difference between those 2 directions was not apparent to anyone sitting at her table, and it required 2 physicians, a considerable quantity of patient correspondence, and a woman named Ruth Mullins who had grown up next door to Dorinda Cole and had watched across 50 years exactly who was invited in and exactly what was placed in front of them. Drop your location in the comments before we go further. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because the road into the community of Pound, Virginia, where Dorinda Cole lived for more than 50 years, still looks exactly like a road into an ordinary mountain town. And the people there now have no idea what the woman in the house on the upper end of that road understood about feeding, and about what feeding, done over years with the right knowledge, can accomplish. Wise County, Virginia in 1911 was a county in transformation. The coal industry had been building its infrastructure through the region for 20 years, and the older farming and timbering economy was contracting into the spaces the new economy had not yet claimed. The community of Pound, near the Kentucky border, had been touched by this transformation in ways both visible: increased transient workers, company store credit systems that restructured how people bought and ate, and invisible, including the disruption of the traditional social networks through which the older residents had managed their relationships for generations. Dorinda Cole was embedded in those older networks. She had been born in Wise County, had married in Wise County, had buried her husband there in 1893, and had remained in the same house, a well-kept frame structure on the upper end of Pound, for the 17 years between his death and the autumn when the investigation began. She was 61 years old in 1911. Short, round-shouldered, with hands that Ruth Mullins would later describe to investigators as the most capable she had ever watched work, quick and certain, with no wasted motion in any task they took on. Her eyes were dark brown and very warm, a warmth that most people experienced as the expression of genuine care, which is what made this case so difficult to reconcile with what the record eventually showed. Because Dorinda Cole's warmth was real. She genuinely cared for the people she fed. The complexity of her case is not that she was cold behind a warm surface. It is that she was genuinely warm on behalf of a purpose that the people she cared for had not been asked to consent to. Ruth Mullins was 2 years older than Dorinda and had lived adjacent to her all her life. She had the particular intimacy that comes from 2 women of similar age growing up within sight of each other in a small community. She knew Dorinda in the ordinary way and in the background way, the way you know someone whose habits you have absorbed across a lifetime without ever deliberately cataloging them. In September 1911, a county physician named Lester Dye came to Ruth Mullins specifically because she was the person in the community who had known Dorinda longest, and because Dye needed someone to help him make sense of something his medical framework was not providing adequate explanation for. What Dye had noticed, over a period of roughly 2 years, was a pattern in his patients in the Pound community that did not correspond to any disease progression he could identify. Some of his patients, mostly older residents, families who had been in the community for generations, had been presenting with a cluster of signs that included unusual vitality, unusually rapid recovery from seasonal illness, and in 2 cases measurable improvement in conditions he had expected to be deteriorating. Other patients, largely the newer arrivals, the transient mining families, people without deep roots in the community, had been presenting with the opposite cluster, a gradual weakening, a susceptibility to illness that exceeded what their ages and conditions should have predicted, a quality of slow diminishment he had attributed, case by case, to the hard conditions of mining life. It was only when a physician in Scott County, a man named Cal Brewster, wrote to Dye asking whether he had observed similar patterns. Because Brewster was seeing the same split in his patient population in communities that overlapped with Dye's service area, that the geographic distribution became visible. The shared element, which both physicians identified independently before comparing notes, was Dorinda Cole. She fed a great many people. She was known for her generosity, and people accepted it. People who ate regularly at her table over months and years appeared in one of 2 clusters, the strengthening cluster or the diminishing cluster. The pattern was not absolute, but it was strong enough and consistent enough that Dye went to Ruth Mullins and asked her directly whether she had any knowledge of what Dorinda put into the food she prepared for different visitors. Ruth Mullins was quiet for a long time. Then she said she had been watching Dorinda cook for 50 years and that there were 2 sets of preparations. She said she had always assumed she understood the difference between them without needing to ask. She said the preparations came from knowledge Dorinda had inherited, from her own mother and from women before her, and that the knowledge was old, older than anything written down in Wise County. Older, Ruth believed, than the county itself. She said that Dorinda had not, as far as Ruth could determine, ever used the knowledge to harm anyone in any immediate or dramatic sense. She said that the question of whether gradually strengthening some people at the gradual expense of others constituted harm was a question she had been carefully not asking for 50 years, and that she was not certain she wanted to start now. Dye submitted a report to the Wise County Board of Health in October 1911, describing the pattern he and Brewster had identified without naming Dorinda Cole in the body of the report. He named her in a separate letter to the board chairman, marked for his eyes only, requesting guidance on what authority the board had to investigate or act. The board chairman wrote back that the board's authority extended to communicable disease and environmental contamination, and that what Dye described did not clearly fall within either category. He suggested consulting the county attorney. The county attorney reviewed Dye's letter and wrote back that he could not identify a statute the described conduct violated, given that the people who had been, in Day's estimation, diminished by their experiences at Dorinda Cole's table had not presented formal complaints and were, in most cases, entirely unaware that any mechanism beyond illness and aging was involved in their condition. There was no arrest, no trial. There was a visit. In November 1911, Lester Dye and Ruth Mullins went together to Dorinda Cole's house. They sat across her kitchen table from her. Dye described what he and Brewster had found. He described the pattern. He described the 2 clusters and the distribution and the geographic element they had traced. Dorinda Cole listened to everything he said. She was not angry or afraid. She said when Dye finished that she had inherited a responsibility that the 2 people across her table from her were too far outside to understand, and that what she did at her table was the continuation of a practice so old that stopping it was not within the authority of the County Board of Health or the county attorney or anyone in 1911 Wise County to require. She said she had never fed anyone in the diminishing direction who did not, in her judgment, deserve diminishment. She said the strengthened ones had all deserved strengthening. She said her judgment on those distinctions was precisely what she had been given the knowledge for. The knowledge and the judgment were not separable. They had been handed down together. Ruth Mullins, in a memoir she wrote in the 1930s that is now in the Wise County Historical Society collection, describes sitting in that kitchen for an hour after Lester Dye left. She and Dorinda talked about things other than the matter at hand: old neighbors, recent weather, a church matter. The ordinary conversation of two women in their 60s who had spent their whole lives within half a mile of each other. Dorinda made tea while they talked. When Ruth walked home, she writes, she was not certain whether she had been given strengthening tea or ordinary tea, and that the uncertainty itself settled into her on the walk home with the quality of a lesson. That Dorinda had said everything she had to say through the visit itself, the conversation with Dye, the explanation that had sounded like justification to Dye but that Ruth understood as factual description, and then the tea, ordinary or otherwise, given to the one person in the room who had spent 50 years watching and who understood the difference. Ruth writes that she never asked Dorinda which tea she had received. She writes that she thinks Dorinda would have told her if she had asked, and that the reason she did not ask was that she had decided she did not want to know which kind of person Dorinda had decided she was. Dorinda Cole died in 1917. She is buried in the Pound Community Cemetery. The house on the upper end of town was sold in 1919 and changed hands several times through the 20th century. It was demolished in 1971 and a small commercial building was constructed on the lot. Lester Dye's personal notes are in the Wise County Historical Society, cataloged under General Physician Correspondence. Ruth Mullins's memoir is in the same collection, donated by her granddaughter in 1958. Both documents are publicly accessible. Both documents stop at the same point, at the kitchen table in November 1911, without going further. As if both Dye and Mullins, in their separate accounts, made the same decision about how much was enough and drew their lines at the same place. What Dorinda Cole's two sets of preparations actually contained, where the knowledge came from and how far back the chain of women who held it extended, how she made her determinations about who deserved strengthening and who deserved diminishment, those questions are not answered in any available document. What is answered is that it worked, at least to the measurable satisfaction of two physicians who had strong professional motivation to find an alternative explanation and could not. And that Dorinda Cole sat across a table from those two physicians and said she had been given the knowledge for a purpose, and that the purpose was hers to administer, and that she had been administering it correctly for as long as she had held it. Here is the question. Dorinda Cole believed she had the authority to decide who was strengthened and who was diminished at her table. She exercised that authority across decades without the knowledge or consent of the people affected. In the context of a mountain community with no other mechanism for the kind of management she apparently believed she was performing, was she a healer operating outside any available system's ability to recognize what she was? Or was she a woman who had inherited power and used it according to her own judgment, in ways the people affected never chose and never knew about? I want to know where you land. Drop it in the comments. Those are not the same thing, and the difference matters. Some women fed the mountains. Some of them fed in both directions. And the mountains, as they always do, kept what was given to them. If this case is the kind that stays in the quiet parts of your thinking after the screen goes dark, subscribe, there are more of them. The archives are not exhausted. Stay with us. There is a section of Ruth Mullins's memoir that is easy to overlook because it is written in the understated way that rural women of that generation wrote about things they considered significant but private. It comes roughly 2/3 of the way through the document, after the November 1911 kitchen visit, in a section that covers the years between 1912 and Dorinda's death in 1917. Ruth writes that she continued to see Dorinda regularly after the visit, that their friendship, which had been lifelong and continuous, did not change in character or frequency as a result of what Dye had brought to the kitchen table. She writes that they did not discuss the matter of the preparations again. Not once. The discussion had happened. The knowledge was held by both of them in the same way it had always been held, privately, below the surface of daily life, in the register reserved for things that were understood without being named. What Ruth does describe in that section is a change she observed in Dorinda in the years after 1911. Not a change in her warmth or her capability, a change in her attention. Ruth writes that Dorinda, in her last years, seemed to be watching the newer families in the community with a quality of sustained appraisal that she had not shown before the Dye visit, as if the visit had prompted her to be more deliberate about the assessments she had previously made by instinct. Ruth writes, "I thought at first she was being careful in a new way, the way a person is careful after they have been questioned. But it was not carefulness. It was something more like inventory. She was taking stock of what remained to be done before she was no longer able to do it." Dorinda died in 1917 at 67 years of age, of causes the death certificate lists as natural decline. She had no children to whom she could have passed the knowledge. She had no apprentice that Ruth knew of. Ruth writes that she believed the chain of women who had held that knowledge ended with Dorinda, and that she had decided she was at peace with that, and that whether the knowledge should have continued or should have stopped when Dorinda died was a question she had sat with for the 20 years between Dorinda's death and the time of writing the memoir, and that she had never arrived at an answer she trusted. Lester Dye's notes stop at November 1911. Ruth Mullins's memoir stops at Dorinda's death in 1917. The community of Pound continued. The mining families came and went. The old families stayed. Whether any of them noticed, over the years between 1912 and 1917, that the pattern Dye had identified was less pronounced than before, whether Dorinda's appraisal in those final years had produced a different ratio of strengthening to diminishment, or whether she had quietly continued exactly as before, is not documented in any available record. The Wise County Historical Society holds both documents in their original form. The collection is accessible. You can read Dye's notes and Ruth's memoir and arrive at the kitchen table in November 1911 yourself, and sit with Dorinda Cole's explanation across the table, the explanation that was not an apology, not a justification, but a simple description of a responsibility, inherited and discharged according to a judgment that no court could challenge, because no statute addressed it, and no complainant had the knowledge required to complain. The tea she made for Ruth on that November evening is not described in either document. Ruth writes only that she received it and drank it and did not ask what it was, and that the walk home in the dark was the longest walk she had taken in a long time. In the particular way that some walks are long not because of the distance, but because of what you are carrying by the time you reach the door. One final thing about the two sets of preparations themselves. Lester Dye, in his personal notes, makes one observation that his official report to the Wise County Board of Health does not include. He writes that when he traced the strengthened patients back through their histories of eating at Dorinda's table and compared the timing of meals to the timing of improvement in their conditions, the improvement did not correlate to a single meal or a handful of meals. It correlated to sustained exposure over months and years. Similarly, the diminishment in the other group was not acute. It was gradual and cumulative. Both processes operated over the same timescale, years of regular presence at that table, a cup of something accepted on a winter afternoon once a month, a meal shared at a season's turning, which means that the knowledge Dorinda Cole held was not the knowledge of a single preparation that did a single thing. It was the knowledge of a sustained relationship between a person who fed and a person who was fed, maintained patiently over time, producing an effect that neither party could have identified if they had examined any single instance in isolation. You had to see the whole arc. You had to compare the health of people who had eaten there regularly for 3 years against the health of people who had not. Dye and Brewster saw the whole arc. Nobody else had looked at it that way before, because nobody else had thought to look. That is the thing about Dorinda Cole that stays with this case. The knowledge she held was not the knowledge of a dramatic act. It was the knowledge of a long, quiet one, and she had been practicing it patiently for as long as she had been setting that table and opening that door to whoever knocked on it, deciding with the particular warm certainty of a woman who had been given a responsibility and carried it without complaint, exactly what to put in front of each face that appeared in her kitchen.